Good evening. My name is Megan Leake. Today I will be presenting my capstone project titled Spatiotemporal Analysis of Malaria Incident and Mortality, where I examine how environmental, climate, and socioeconomic factors interact to influence malaria patterns across African countries over time. This project aims to provide both predictive insights and a deeper understanding of the drivers of malaria burdens. Malaria remains one of the most persistent global health challenges. Each year, there are hundreds of millions of infections and a significant number of deaths, particularly among vulnerable populations such as children and pregnant women. The burden is heavily concentrated in sub Saharan Africa, where environmental conditions are favorable for mosquito survival and transmission. Malaria transmission is closely tied to environmental factors. Temperature affects both mosquito and parasite development. Rainfall creates breeding habits, and humidity increases mosquito lifespan. However, malaria is not just an environmental disease, it is deeply connected to socioeconomic conditions, including poverty, housing quality, education, and access to health care. Because of this, malaria continues to impact not only health outcomes, but also economic development and social stability. Before going into the modeling, it's important to briefly understand how malaria is transmitted. Malaria spreads through a cycle involving humans, mosquitoes, and parasites. It begins when an infected female mosquito bites a human, injecting malaria parasites into the bloodstream. These parasites then travel to the liver, where they multiply silently during an early stage of infection. After that, they move into the bloodstream and infect red blood cells, which is when symptoms like fever, chills, and anemia begin to appear. The cycle continues when another mosquito bites the infected person and ingests the parasites. That mosquito then becomes infected and can transmit malaria to another person, continuing the cycle. The key takeaway here is that malaria transmission depends on both biological processes and environmental conditions, particular factors that support mosquito survival. This is why climate and environmental variables play such an important role in malaria modeling. Although many studies have attempted to model malaria, there are several key limitations in existing approaches. First, many models focus primarily on environmental factors, especially climate variables, without fully incorporating socioeconomic and healthcare related drivers. Second, some models lack a strong temporal component, meaning they do not adequately capture how malaria patterns evolve over time. Third, many approaches rely on aggregated data, which can mask important local variations and emerging hotspots. These limitations highlight the need for a more integrated framework that considers multiple dimensions simultaneously. This motivated my study to combine environmental, socioeconomic, and healthcare variables within a spatial temporal modeling approach. The central problem addressed in this study is that current malaria models do not adequately capture the complexity of malaria dynamics. Specifically, they often fail to represent interactions between different drivers and do not fully account for spatial and temporal variations. As a result, predictions may be less accurate and public health interventions may not be optimally targeted. To address this, my study has five main objectives. First, to analyze long term malaria trends in Africa from 2000 to 2024. Second, to identify key drivers, including environmental, socioeconomic, and healthcare factors. Third, to detect persistent hotspots and emerging high risk areas. Fourth, to improve predictive performance using both statistical and machine learning methods. And fifth, to forecast the next 10 years. This study is based on the hypothesis that malaria transmission is driven by the interaction between environmental conditions and socioeconomic vulnerability. For example, even if environmental conditions are suitable for transmission, strong healthcare systems and prevention measures can reduce actual disease burden. In contrast, areas with weak infrastructure may experience higher transmission even under moderate environmental conditions. Additionally, I hypothesize that malaria mortality is more strongly influenced by healthcare access than by environmental factors. Overall, these relationships are expected to be complex and nonlinear. To conduct this analysis, I have integrated multiple data sets from reliable international sources. These included malaria data from the WHO Global Health Observatory, socioeconomic indicators from the World Bank, and environmental data from climate repositories. The final data set includes 45 African countries over a 25-year period. Each observation represents a country year pair, forming a panel data set that captures both temporal trends and cross country variation. During pre-processing, I standardized variables, resolved inconsistencies across datasets, and ensured alignment by country and year. Missing data was addressed using a multi-step approach. First, forward fill was applied to maintain temporal continuity. Then backwards fill was used where needed. Finally, remaining gaps were used using mean imputation. This approach ensured a complete data set while preserving meaningful patterns in the data. Next slide. For modeling, I used a forward chaining time series approach to preserve temporal structure and avoid data leakage. The models were trained on data from 2000 to 2019 and evaluated on data from 2020 to 2024. I implemented several models, including a naive lag based model, ridge regression, and machine learning models such as XGBoost, LightGBM, and CatBoost. The naive model served as a baseline by using the previous year's value as a prediction. Model performance was evaluated using RMSE, MAE, and R squared to capture accuracy and explanatory power. To enhance interpretability, I use SHAP values, which allow us to quantify the contribution of each feature to model predictions and better understand the underlying driver. The results show that malaria burden is highly uneven across countries. The highest burden is concentrated in West and Central Africa, where both incident and mortality rates remain high. In contrast, several countries show very low or near zero incident, indicating successful control or elimination. One important finding is that these geographic patterns have remained relatively stable over time. This suggests that underlying structural factors, such as climate conditions and socioeconomic vulnerability, continue to drive malaria risk. When analyzing trends over time, we observe different trajectories across countries. Some countries, such as Madagascar and Rwanda, show increasing malaria burden. Others show stable or declining trends, possibly due to improved interventions and healthcare systems. These differences highlight that progress in malaria control is uneven. Identifying countries with increasing trends is particularly important for targeting future interventions. The correlation analysis provides insight into how different variables are related. There is a strong positive correlation between malaria incidence and mortality, which is expected. Environmental variables include rainfall, temperature, and humidity, show strong positive associations with malaria incident. Socioeconomic indicators such as poverty and limited access to resources are also associated with higher malaria burden. On the other hand, healthcare related variables include access to services and sanitation are negatively associated with mortality. This slide shows the distribution of malaria incident across African countries, highlighting how uneven the burden is. One of the most important takeaways is the wide variation in malaria incidence. Some countries, particularly in North Africa, have near zero incidence, while others, like Burkina Faso and the Central African Republic, have extremely high rates, exceeding 400 cases per 1,000 people at risk. This tells us that malaria is not uniformly distributed, but instead highly concentrated in specific regions. Another key observation is that countries naturally fall into three burden groups: high, moderate, and low. As shown in the bar chart, a large number of countries fall into the high burden category, which suggests that a significant portion of Africa is still heavily affected. Finally, we see a clear geographical concentration of high burden, particularly in West and Central Africa. These regions consistently show the highest incident levels, indicating that they carry a disproportionate share of the malaria burden. Overall, this slide emphasizes that malaria is both spatially uneven and regionally concentrated. This slide builds on the previous one by showing the geographic distribution of malaria burden across Africa. One of the most striking findings is the presence of strong spatial clustering. High burden countries, shown in red, are clearly concentrated in West and Central Africa. In contrast, lower burden countries, shown in green, are mostly located in North and Southern Africa. This pattern tells us that malaria is not randomly distributed, it follows clear geographic trends. We also observe a regional gradient in risk. There is a noticeable north to south and west to east transition where moderate burden countries, shown in blue, form a kind of buffer zone between high and low burden regions. This suggests that malaria risk changes gradually across regions rather than abruptly. From a public health perspective, these patterns have important implications. Because malaria's burden varies so much geographically, a one size fits all strategy is not effective. Instead, interventions need to be targeted and region specific, focusing more resources on high burden areas while maintaining control efforts in low burden regions. Overall, this spatial clustering highlights the importance of geography in understanding managing malaria risk. This slide summarizes the performance of different models used to predict malaria incidence and mortality. Starting with the overall performance, we see that all models perform very well, with R squared values above 0.94 for both incidence and mortality. This indicates that the models are able to explain most of the variation in the data. Looking more closely at the tables, we can compare the models using RMSE and MAE, which measures prediction error. For malaria incidence, models like Ridge Regression and Cat Boost perform slightly better than others, but the differences are relatively small. Similarly, for malaria mortality, performance across models is also very close, with only minor variations in error metrics. However, the most important takeaway from this slide is not about which model is best, but the key insights about the data itself. We observed that malaria exhibits strong temporal persistence, meaning that past values are highly predictive of future outcomes. Because of this, more complex machine learning models do not significantly outperform simpler models. Go back one, Ariana, please. This slide shows the key drivers of malaria incident and mortality using SHAP values to interpret the model. SHAP is important because it allows us to understand which variables contribute most to the model's predictions, even in complex machine learning models. Starting with malaria incidence shown on the left, the most important drivers are primarily environmental factors. Rainfall, temperature, and humidity all play major roles, which makes sense because they directly influence mosquito breeding and survival. Population density is also important as higher population concentrations can increase transmission. When we look at malaria mortality shown on the right, the pattern changes. Here, the most important drivers are healthcare and infrastructure, such as access to healthcare, health expenditure, and sanitation. These factors do not necessarily affect transmission, but they strongly influence whether infected individuals survive. The key insights from the slide is that different processes drive incidence and mortality. Environmental conditions primarily determine where malaria spreads, while healthcare systems determine who survives. This distinction is important for policy because it suggests that reducing transmission and reducing death requires different types of interventions. This slide presents the African-wide malaria forecast from 2025 to 2035, comparing predictions across multiple models. Starting with the historical trend on the left, we can see that malaria incidence has generally declined over time, although it stabilizes in recent years. When we move into the forecast period, one key takeaway is the consistency across models. All models predict relatively stable malaria incidence with only small variations between them. This reflects a very important characteristic of the data, which is strong temporal persistence. In other words, past malaria levels are highly predictive of future values. Another important finding is that the naive model remains highly competitive. Even though more complex machine learning models were used, they do not significantly outperform the simple lag based approach. This suggests that increasingly model complexity alone does not necessarily improve predictive performance. Finally, in terms of implication, these results indicate that to improve forecasting, we may need to focus less on model complexity and more on incorporating additional external drivers, such as climate, intervention strategies, and policy changes. In conclusion, malaria is a complex disease influenced by environment, socioeconomic, and healthcare factors. The study highlights the importance of considering these factors together rather than in isolation. It also demonstrates the strong temporal persistence of malaria patterns. Overall, this integrated approach provides valuable insight for improving prediction and informing public health strategies. For future work, incorporating higher resolution data could improve the identification of local hotspots. Integrating real-time data could support early warning systems. Additionally, applying causal inference methods could help better understand the relationships between different drivers. These are my references. And I would like to thank Dr. Pinky for all her assistance this semester. I really have enjoyed working on this project. I would like to thank the School of Applied Computational Sciences, and I would like to thank my family, friends, and loved ones for all their support.